Chapter 1, The Derailment at Pine Hollow. The train lay on its side like a felled beast, one wheel still spinning as smoke hissed from its cracked boiler. Steam hung low over the tracks, thick as gauze, masking the crushed timbers and scattered coal like the aftermath of some battlefield skirmish. The snowfall, soft at dawn, now picked up pace, burying debris beneath a white shroud even as bodies were still being recovered. I stood on the embankment just above the wreckage, coat collar turned up against the wind, notebook in hand. The 9:12 express from Pittsburgh had left the rails just after entering the Pine Hollow turn, a narrow pass flanked by coal shafts on one side and thick woods on the other. Of the dozen passengers aboard, 11 survived with bruises and broken limbs. The 12th was Lawrence Baird, auditor for the Central Steel and Rail Syndicate. Dead before the engine stopped moving. "Wasn't the crash that got him," said the stationmaster, a wiry man named Kemper, as he approached me through the snow. "Found him with his head against the wall. No blood. No glass near him. Just, slumped like he fell asleep and forgot to wake up." "Show me," I said. Kemper led me to the first passenger car. It rested awkwardly on one side, its frame splintered but intact. Inside, the smell of smoke mixed with scorched varnish and blood. Near the middle of the cabin, a bench had collapsed onto itself. On the floor, covered with a blanket, was Baird. I knelt and pulled the fabric back that he was middle-aged, well-fed, with a thick salt mustache and calloused hands that suggested he did more than push ink. His glasses were still tucked in his vest. No visible wounds. But his left glove bulged oddly. I eased it off. A small paper scrap fell into my palm, curled from sweat and heat. It wasn't a note. It was a cipher. No words, just 6 rows of alternating slashes, dots, and triangles, drawn in pencil on stationery marked Hotel Caslin, Baltimore. I studied it carefully, then folded it into my case. "Any luggage?" I asked. "Trunk," said Kemper. "Already sent to the boarding house. Widow's waiting." "Widow?" "Arrived last night. Said she was meeting him on his return. They'd been apart for a few weeks." I nodded and stood. "Keep everyone out of this car for now." Back outside, I joined Hiram, who was bent over the tracks a few yards ahead. "You see this?" he said, pointing to the cold iron rail. "Spikes on this curve were loosened, some yanked clean out. Deliberate tampering." I crouched and ran my gloved fingers along the base. The rail had shifted just enough to let the wheel hop. "Sabotage," I muttered. "Looks fresh," Hiram added. "No rust on the missing spike holes. Someone hit this section maybe hours before the train came through." "Too precise for miners," I said. "This was done by someone who understood derailment, how to mask it as accident." Hiram looked down the white path of the twisted rail line. "Then Baird wasn't unlucky," he said. "He was marked." We left the wreckage behind and headed into the village proper. Pine Hollow was a pit town, 3 dirt streets, a general store, a brothel disguised as a temperance hotel, and a boarding house that doubled as a telegraph station. Coal dust grimed everything, from children's cheeks to windowsills and wedding dresses. Inside the boarding house, we were met by Mrs. Lillian Baird. She wore black already, though her eyes suggested she hadn't yet processed the need. She sat in the parlor with hands folded tight and a hard purse of the lips. "Mr. Pinkerton," she said as we entered. "You believe this was no accident?" "I believe your husband's death deserves full scrutiny," I replied. She nodded once, then reached into her coat and pulled out a small charred fragment of paper. "This was in his coat pocket," she said. Our laundress found it this morning. I took it gently. Though badly burned at the edges, 2 words remained clear: Holloway, list. You recognize the name? Brent Holloway, she said. He works for the mine company, oversees coal weight reports and worker payments. Lawrence didn't trust him. Why? Because something didn't add up. He said there were shipments vanishing. Falsified weights. Hidden accounts. He thought someone was stealing from the company. But when he pushed for a full audit, they delayed it. He told me, if anything happened, to give this to someone outside the company. I slipped the burnt page beside the cipher in my case. Did your husband mention a cipher? I asked. Or the Hotel Caslin in Baltimore? She looked puzzled. He stayed there once. A month ago, I think. He said it was business not worth sharing. And then he came back, changed. Wary. Always looking over his shoulder. The fire in the grate crackled loudly. Outside, a whistle blew, distant, mechanical, hollow. A coal cart returning from the mine shaft. Where can I find Holloway? I asked. He hasn't shown up today. His crew said he left before dawn. Packed anything? No. Just vanished. Hiram, standing by the window, turned sharply. That's twice now, the engineer's gone too. First the man who drove the train, now the one Baird was watching. We left the boarding house and crossed the snowy square toward the mining company's offices. The brick building loomed like a coffin, blackened by years of coal soot. Inside, a single lamp flickered behind a frosted glass door marked Operations. The clerk inside, young, nervous, missing 2 front teeth, looked up when I showed my badge. Brent Holloway, I said. I need his office. He don't have one, the boy said. Holloway kept everything in the lantern room. What room? Tower beside the shaft, he muttered. He used it to write reports. Liked the quiet. Key? Hiram asked. The boy fumbled through a drawer and handed it over. But I wouldn't go there at night. Why not? Some say it's cursed. That's where the old payroll ledger burned up, years back. During the war. I pocketed the key. Curses didn't scare me. Ledgers that burned themselves, those did. Chapter 2, The Widow in the Boarding House. The lantern room sat atop a narrow brick tower near Shaft 3, just beyond the coal elevator cage. At night, its glass panes gave off a faint amber glow, visible from every corner of Pine Hollow like a watchful eye. As Hiram and I trudged toward it through frozen slush, the wind howled low through rusted beams and tangled rope lines. The tower's silhouette leaned slightly eastward, as if wary of its own contents. We reached the door just past dusk. The key slid in easily, but the lock resisted, a sign of age, or tampering. Inside, the air was bitter with coal dust and oil. Soot-streaked walls bore hooks for hanging lanterns, but now held only 3. The room itself was no more than 10 feet wide, with a narrow desk bolted beneath a frost-caked window. A single chair sat tipped on its side. Someone left in a hurry, Hiram muttered. I bent to examine the desk. Inside the top drawer was a stack of faded ledgers, official mine weights, payroll signatures, transport manifests. But at the very back, behind a warped partition, we found something else. A smaller notebook, bound in black leather, its pages brittle and partially burned. I turned to a page marked by a bent paperclip. Baird is pressing. He knows something. Saw the August shaft reports. If he matches them with the freight logs, the whole system caves. I told C we had to move. C said he'd handle it. I don't want to know how. The entry had no date. But a second line, hastily scribbled, read, "Do not leave Cipher behind." "See," I murmured. "Could be Crane." Hiram raised an eyebrow. "Who's Crane?" "Elias Crane," I replied. "Private agent out of Baltimore. Used to work for military contracts during the war. Known for loyalty, when it pays well. I met him once. Sharp dresser, sharper lies. You think he's here?" I think if Baird feared Holloway and a man called C, and both vanish after a derailment, then yes. He's here, or was. We took the ledger and returned to the boarding house. Mrs. Baird sat alone in the parlor, her gloved hands clasped tightly over a handkerchief. The fire had died to a few glowing embers. "I need to ask you something difficult," I said gently. "About your husband's papers." She nodded, lips pressed tight. "You gave me the burned fragment earlier. Was that all he left you?" Her fingers trembled. From the folds of her coat, she retrieved a second slip of paper. "I didn't want to seem paranoid," she whispered. "But I couldn't sleep. Not after hearing you say the tracks were tampered with." I unfolded the note. It was in Baird's handwriting. "If anything happens, don't go to Crane. Go to someone outside. Finch is compromised. Holloway is nervous. I've hidden the cipher. Trust no one until it's solved." "Finch?" I asked. "Railway attorney," she said. "He's in Pittsburgh. Handled most of Lawrence's contracts." "And this cipher," I said, "any idea where it might be?" She hesitated. "There's one more thing." She rose and crossed to a side table, removing a velvet jewelry box. Inside was a locket, and folded behind the miniature portrait of Lawrence was another scrap of paper. It matched the cipher I found in Baird's glove, but this one bore a faint smudge across its edge. When I held it near the lamplight, I realized it wasn't ink, it was coal dust. "Whoever handled this last," I said, "did so in the mine." "Could it be a map?" Hiram asked. I shook my head. "No, these are symbols. Triangles, lines, slashes. But some groupings repeat. It's a code. Military? Possibly. Or ledger-based. Worth comparing against those freight books from the tower." I turned to Mrs. Baird. "Has anyone else spoken to you since your husband's death? Pressed for his things?" She looked pale. "A man came this morning. Tall, black coat, cane with silver bands. Said he was from the company. Asked for Lawrence's effects." "And you gave him?" "Nothing," she said. "He made me uneasy. Left without giving his name." "That was Crane," I muttered. "He's here." Back in our room upstairs, Hiram and I laid out every page from the black ledger alongside the cipher slips. There was overlap. One column listed coal weights, another initials, H, J, W, and still another, a repeating symbol in the margin that matched the slashes in Baird's cipher. "This was never about coal," I said. "This was about movement, freight shifting hands, signatures forged, quantities adjusted on paper. And bribes coded through those symbols." "Exactly. Someone used the mine's daily grind to hide a second operation, illegal or stolen goods rerouted under false documentation." "But why kill Baird now?" I tapped the cipher. "Because he cracked it. And once he linked the code to Holloway's initials in the ledger, he was too dangerous. A knock at our door interrupted us. It was a boy, no more than 12, wearing a cap too large and boots too thin. "You're the detectives?" he asked. I nodded. "We are. I seen Holloway," he whispered. "This morning. By the shaft. He was talking to someone in the fog. A man with a black cane. They were shouting, then Holloway ran off. The man stayed behind." "You're sure?" "I know Holloway's face," he said. "He used to give my pa half his pay in whiskey. I never forget a face like that. Can you show us where?" The boy nodded. "Then bundle up," I said. "You're about to take us where the cipher began, and maybe where it ends." Outside, snow drifted sideways across the cobbled road. But something deeper than weather hung in the air now. Something hidden. And afraid. Chapter 3, The Ledger in the Lantern Room. The boy led us down a narrow slag trail that cut behind the old tool sheds and slag heaps, toward a part of the mine yard most avoided, where the ore carts went to rust and where the timbers groaned even in stillness. Shaft 12, he said, hadn't been used in years. The entrance was boarded, but not locked. The boy stopped at the edge. "That's where I saw M," he whispered. "Holloway and the man in the black coat. They was argin'. One yelled, 'You said there was no paper trail.' Then Holloway bolted. I knelt near the boards. Frost crusted the planks, but the nails were fresh. Whoever sealed this shaft meant to return, and quickly." "Good lad," I said. "Now go home. Tell no one where you've been." The boy nodded and vanished into the snow. Hiram pried the boards loose with a crowbar while I kept watch. Inside was pure darkness, cold and wet, the air smelling of iron and mildew. We struck matches and descended carefully with lanterns. Timber beams arched overhead, draped in black frost and silence. Near the bottom, just before the rails curved sharply left, we found a sealed door carved into the rock face. A brass placard, blackened by coal soot, read, "Vault 2, Archive Storage." I tested the handle. Locked. "I've seen this type before," Hiram said, pulling a key ring from his coat. "Company vaults. Used during the war to store payroll manifests and confidential shipping ledgers. Exactly the kind of thing Holloway would have wanted kept hidden." After a few clicks, the lock yielded. Inside the vault was a single iron cabinet, its drawers labeled in faint chalk, 1863, 1864, 1865. A tattered ledger sat atop the cabinet, bound in cracked leather. Unlike the books upstairs, this one bore no title, just a red string tied around the clasp. I opened it carefully. Inside, the handwriting changed every few pages. Some pages were water-damaged, others clean. But every entry followed a format: initials, amounts, locations, and finally, symbols, slashes, dots, and triangles. The cipher. "This is it," I said. "The full record." We flipped to the final pages. One line read, "CB, 48 tons/2100/ diverted to Blackwell, verified by EC." Another read, "Baird match confirmed. Vault must be sealed. Destroy cipher if compromised." "EC," Hiram murmured. "Elias Crane." "Or Evelyn Cartwright," I replied. "Crane's old alias during the war. He used it on false tribunals to secure army contracts." I remembered now, Crane had been caught once forging Union records to discredit a whistleblower. Never convicted. Always vanished before the noose. So Baird found the original, I said. He decoded this. Confronted Holloway. Threatened to expose it all. And Crane came to make sure that never happened, Hiram finished. Suddenly, a thump echoed from above, soft, deliberate. Someone's at the entrance, I hissed. We closed the vault quietly and backed into the tunnel. But when we reached the shaft entrance, daylight was gone. The planks had been nailed back in place from the outside. Sealed in. Well, Hiram muttered, that's bold. We're not staying, I said. We followed a side tunnel that arched beneath the company yard, hoping it hadn't collapsed with age. For an hour we crawled through dripping rock and buried carts, our lanterns flickering low. But just before the last flame died, we emerged through a maintenance hatch beside the old coal tipple. Cold air hit us like a slap. Crane tried to bury us, Hiram said. That's twice he's silenced a witness. And he knows we have the ledger now. We'll need to protect the evidence, I said. And expose him before he disappears again. We returned to the boarding house under the cover of night. I slipped the ledger beneath the mattress, then wrote 2 telegrams, one to our Pittsburgh office requesting background on every transaction from the Pine Hollow mine, and the other to Judge Samuel Rook in Harrisburg, a federal magistrate with no ties to the rail syndicate. Crane will strike again, I said. He's not the type to leave ends loose. He's got no idea how tight this one's tied, Hiram said, tapping the mattress. But even as I locked the room and double-checked the windows, I couldn't shake the image of those cipher marks, repeating across the pages like a drumbeat. This wasn't just fraud. This was a pattern of control, rail lines rerouted, payrolls siphoned, wartime logistics twisted into personal gain. And it stretched back years. Back to the war. Back to people who had learned how to profit from silence, and now feared someone like Baird had found a way to break it. In the hall below, a board creaked. I grabbed my revolver and cracked the door. Only the wind. But I knew Crane was out there. Watching. Waiting. Chapter 4, The Man from Baltimore. The next morning broke brittle and gray. The frost on the windows was thicker than usual, and the town felt quieter, as though something important was holding its breath. I stood near the telegraph office watching the operator tap out my coded dispatch to Judge Rook. I'd written a summary of the ledger, Baird's death, and our sealed shaft discovery. The reply would take hours to arrive, if the line wasn't tampered with. Hiram returned from the station with a telegram in hand and a grim look. Crane's here, he said. Signed in at the rail office as E. Kavanaugh. Claimed to be auditing property insurance on behalf of the syndicate. Bunked at the Temperance Hotel. Kavanaugh, I scoffed. One of his old aliases. Used it during the Atlanta munitions scandal. Room 3, Hiram added. Paid in cash. Left early. We made our way there on foot. The hotel sat crooked on the corner of Main and Dole, a whitewashed wreck of a building with warped porches and flaking paint. The woman at the front desk barely looked up as we passed. Room 3 was unlocked. Inside, the scent of pipe smoke still hung in the air. The bed was unslept in. The only sign of use was a chair drawn to the window, its cushion still warm. Watching the street, I murmured. He's been tracking us. On the table was a cigar stub, half-smoked, brand imported from Havana. A rare luxury in a mining town. Beside it lay a crumpled paper scrap. Vault, gone. Pinkerton active. H to be watched. Move plan up. I pocketed it. We were now part of his schedule. Hiram rifled through the wardrobe and came up with a satchel hidden behind a hanging coat. Inside, railway maps, a revolver wrapped in oilcloth, and a leather wallet containing credentials from 3 separate rail companies, all forged. "This isn't just cleanup," I said. "This is preparation. Crane setting up a network. Changing names, buying time." We took everything and returned to our rooms. I hid the documents beneath the floorboards and opened the ledger again. Now that we had 2 cipher slips, I could begin comparing their patterns to the ledger margins. I wrote them side by side. /// /// They're column markers, I said aloud. Each symbol corresponds to a section: coal weights, transfer station, initials, payment. Hiram leaned closer. "And repeated patterns represent quantities? Or names? If we had a full cipher key, we could decode the payments." We spent the next hour aligning entries to symbols, using initials from the shaft logs as anchors. It was slow work, but by mid-afternoon, a name emerged. JT, 1,000 paid from Charleston Deposit. EC authorized. JT, I said. "That's Jeremiah Tulliver, the freight agent who vanished last year. Disappeared with $8,000 from the pay car manifest." "You think Crane helped cover that up?" "I think Crane wrote the orders himself," I said. EC wasn't just an alias, he embedded it as a signature. Hidden in plain sight. Then came a knock at the door. Hiram and I froze. I approached with caution, revolver drawn, and opened the door 2 inches. There he stood. Tall, long black coat, silver-handled cane. Hair slicked back. No visible weapon, but the kind of calm that only a man with many in reach could wear. "Allan Pinkerton," he said smoothly. "How delightful." "Elias Crane," I returned, keeping my hand on the door. "You're bold, showing your face." He smirked. "In this town, no one knows the difference between a saboteur and a savior. What do you want?" "To talk," he said. "Briefly. Before the railroad does something regrettable." He raised his hands slowly and stepped inside. We didn't offer him a seat. "You've been busy," I said. "So have you," he replied. "Vault 2. Nice work. Shame it won't matter." I gestured to the satchel on the floor. "You left in a hurry." I assumed I'd be interrupted. "But I didn't expect you'd be that fast. You haven't lost your edge." I moved closer. "Baird trusted you once. Told his wife not to come near you. Said you were compromised." Crane's eyes flicked momentarily, then returned to their cold calm. "Lawrence was brave. Unfortunately, bravery isn't a shield. You killed him." "I advised others to act quickly," he said, carefully. "But I didn't cut the rail. That was Holloway's domain." "Where is he?" "Panicking," Crane said. "And frankly, I'm concerned he'll crack before the real storm hits." I stepped forward. "There's no storm. This ends now." Crane's voice dropped. "You don't understand. This isn't about a derailment. It's not even about a missing ledger. This is about balance. Too many men from the war found ways to survive through systems like these. You destroy this one, and the rest start to crumble. Philadelphia. Baltimore. Louisville. You say that like a threat," I said. "I say it like a fact," Crane replied. "There are people in boardrooms who've never touched a coal shovel that would bury you to keep their ledgers clean. Then let them try. Crane sighed and stepped back toward the door. I'll give you this, Allan, you still believe in justice. You always did. And you never did, I answered. He tipped his hat. We'll meet again. Soon. And then he left. We stood in silence. He came to rattle us, Hiram said. And warn us, I replied. Not to back down, but that we're getting close. And that someone powerful is scared. That evening, the reply from Judge Rook arrived. It was brief. Message received. Secure all evidence. Will dispatch federal order. Await further contact. I folded the note carefully. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here. Chapter 5, The Cipher in the Coal Dust. The boy returned just after midnight. He tapped at our window in the boarding house with coal-smudged fingers, his breath fogging the glass. When I let him in, he didn't speak at first, just held out a small, soot-covered tin box, the kind that once held chewing tobacco. Found it in the shaft wall, he whispered. Behind the lantern hook. Thought maybe it belonged to Baird. I opened the box carefully. Inside, nestled between layers of felt, were 3 folded scraps of paper, stiff with coal dust. But what made my chest tighten was what lay beneath them. A cipher key. It was a simple grid, letters across the top, symbols down the side. Each triangle, slash, or dot corresponded to a letter or number. It wasn't elegant. It was utilitarian. Designed for men who worked with their hands, who could memorize a system faster than they could read a paragraph. Beside the grid was a final note in Baird's handwriting. If they find this, they'll bury me. If you find it, finish what I started. Holloway is the link. Crane is the hammer. But the one holding the handle, you already suspect him. LB. I sat down slowly. The handle. Someone above Holloway and Crane. Finch? Hiram asked, peering over my shoulder. Too obvious, I murmured. Finch is compromised, sure. But not brilliant. This is someone who can orchestrate from behind a desk, while others take the fall. We laid out the previous cipher pages on the floor and began translating using the key. It was slow, exacting work, but by the time dawn painted the windows orange, we had enough of the message to read it aloud. Baird to H, new audit confirms funds rerouted via Holloway to Haven Trust. Crane intercepts comms. Do not trust documents from JR in Pittsburgh. Ledger backup in Shaft 12 must be sealed. No copies beyond initials list. They must not find the names. Haven Trust, Hiram said. That's a banking firm in Philadelphia. High profile. Private. And JR, I added. That's Jacob Rudd, the syndicate's executive officer. We now had confirmation that Rudd, the man who signed Baird's audit orders, was actively burying evidence. Baird sent this to Holloway? Hiram asked. No, I said. This was a memo to himself. Something he planned to give someone, maybe us, maybe a lawyer. But he never made it. I paced the room. Baird knew the audit revealed rerouted funds. Holloway was the facilitator. Crane was watching. And someone, likely Rudd, wanted the ledger hidden forever. And when Baird didn't hand it over, they used the train. Outside, the street grew noisy as miners prepared for shift. Somewhere a cart rolled over frozen gravel. I tucked the cipher and key into my vest. We need the initials list, I said. Hiram pointed to the stack of loose ledger pages we'd pulled from Vault 2. It's in there. He was cataloging people tied to the scheme, workers, agents, lawyers, freight bosses. And if we can match their initials to bank records from Haven Trust, I said, we can prove full conspiracy. We packed up and headed for the one man in Pine Hollow with access to banking transfers, an old rail accountant named Wexler who retired after a freight mishap and now ran a pawn shop full of ledgers and unpaid debts. Wexler was skeletal, with yellow teeth and a voice like worn sandpaper. "You want what?" he rasped when we explained. "Wire receipts from Haven Trust, routed through syndicate accounts," I said. "We're looking for transactions authorized by DC or JR involving Brent Holloway or any mining staff initials." Wexler eyed us warily. "You ain't planning to die today, are you? I've made it through worse." He motioned us into the back room. 2 hours later, amid dust and brittle receipts, we had our match. Transfer, $2,100, authorized, EC, recipient, JT, freight agent, Blackwell Yard. Transfer, $3,500, authorized, JR, recipient, BH, Shaft 12 supervisory. And finally, transfer, $7,000, authorized, EC, beneficiary account, HT Rudd Legal Trust. HT, I whispered. Haven Trust. And the Rudd Legal Trust. The man holding the handle wasn't just involved, he was profiting. Rudd had created a legal trust using the same bank where the funds were routed. The circle was closed. But we had a problem. Rudd was untouchable unless we could tie him directly to the derailment, and Baird's death. And only 2 men could do that. One was Crane. The other was missing. "I say we find Holloway," Hiram said. I agreed. We returned to the shaft entrance with dynamite in our backpacks and spiked boots strapped tight. This time, we weren't descending for ledgers. We were hunting a man hiding in the dark. Shaft 12 was colder than before. The tunnel floor had frozen patches, and wind whispered through cracks we hadn't noticed last time. Further in, we found footprints, fresh ones. Moving in circles. Tracks of a man uncertain of where to go next. "He's still down here," I whispered. We followed the prints past the storage vault into an unmarked shaft that bent like a broken elbow. A soft clinking echoed ahead. We turned the corner and saw him. Brent Holloway. Gaunt. Pale. Kneeling beside a broken lantern, shivering. When he saw us, he raised both hands and spoke in a cracked voice. "I didn't kill him," he said. "Then tell us who did." He closed his eyes. Crane set the trap. But it was Rudd who gave the order. Chapter 6, The Disappearance of Elias Crane. We pulled Brent Holloway from the shaft at dawn. He was too weak to walk far, so Hiram supported him down the icy trail while I cleared a path through the brush. His skin was waxy, lips cracked from thirst, and his clothes carried the sour stench of coal water and fear. But his eyes, those told the story of a man who had finally stopped running. We laid him on a cot in the constable's storeroom and brought him broth and a wool blanket. "Tell us everything," I said once his hands stopped shaking. Holloway's voice rasped like wine through gravel. "Baird was close," he whispered. "Too close. He found a pattern in the coal transfers. Showed me the cipher. Said he'd bring it to the board. That he had a copy of the ledger and names. And?" I asked. "He offered me a chance to come clean. Said if I handed over my own notes, he'd testify that I cooperated. I said I needed time to think. But I was scared. I told Crane. You called in the wolf, Hiram muttered. Holloway nodded slowly. Crane didn't hesitate. Said the only way to protect the whole operation was to eliminate Baird and destroy the vault records. And the derailment? I loosened the rail under Crane's instruction. He said it would look like an accident. But the plan was to kill Baird before the train even left. Someone was supposed to drug his whiskey. They panicked when he didn't drink it. The crash became Plan B. And then I pressed. When I realized Baird had hidden a second copy of the cipher, I tried to back out. Crane threatened me. Told me to disappear or I'd join Baird at the bottom of the lake. But you stayed, I said. I came back to burn the vault. I thought if I destroyed the ledger, I could walk away. Then I saw you and Hiram near the lantern tower. I knew it was too late. And Rudd? I asked. How deep is he in? Holloway swallowed hard. He created the Haven Trust shell during the war. It's where all diverted funds went, to the same account. He hired Crane as his private agent. Crane doesn't just work for the syndicate, he works for Rudd personally. I nodded. We now had motive, names, financial trails, and the last man still breathing who could testify to all of it. I stepped outside the station and sent an urgent wire to Judge Rook. Holloway in custody. Confession obtained. Move on Rudd and Crane before news spreads. Ledger and cipher intact. Pinkerton. When I returned, Holloway was asleep, and Hiram sat beside him, arms folded. I'll watch him, he said. You should find Crane before he disappears. I nodded. He won't wait now. Not if he suspects we've flipped Holloway. I headed straight for the Temperance Hotel, where Crane had last been seen. The clerk, a squat man with ink-stained sleeves, paled when I showed my badge. He checked out an hour ago, he said. Left without breakfast. Said he was going to the freight yard. Alone? No. 2 men with him, rail agents. Big, serious. Didn't say a word. That didn't bode well. I raced to the yard, heart thudding. The depot was busy with coal carts and loading cranes, but no sign of Crane. The agent on duty shook his head when I described him. Hasn't come through here, he said. But check the Riverside depot. We saw a covered carriage head that way. I crossed the yard on foot and reached the Riverside in 20 minutes. A tugboat was preparing to depart, steam already puffing from its stack. And there on the pier, boarding with a leather satchel under one arm, was Elias Crane. I stepped out from behind a crate. Going somewhere, Elias? He froze. Then turned, slowly. His expression was calm, but his knuckles were white around the cane. Allan, he said. You're remarkably persistent. You ran, I said. No, he replied. I repositioned. You abandoned your employer. Took files. Witnesses are talking. Crane raised an eyebrow. Which one? Baird? Holloway? I didn't answer. He sighed. You don't understand how deep this goes. Rudd isn't a man you arrest. He's a man you negotiate with. I don't negotiate with men who kill typists and auditors. You should, Crane said. Because this ledger you're protecting, this cipher, it's just one spoke on the wheel. You think Rudd invented this? He's a steward, not a mastermind. You're stalling. I drew my revolver. Crane's eyes flicked to it, then to the waiting boat. "Won't you regret this?" he asked. "No," I said. "But you will." I stepped forward and cuffed him. Later that night, we returned to the station house. Holloway was still there, dozing under Hiram's watchful eye. Crane sat in a separate cell, smirking. "I'll be out in a week," he said as I locked the door. "The board will bury this. Rudd has lawyers thicker than your ledger pages." I didn't answer. Instead, I placed the cipher key on the table between us. "We broke your code," I said. "Every name. Every number. You're not clever anymore. You're just caught." He didn't speak after that. The next morning, Judge Rook arrived by rail with 2 U.S. Marshals and a sealed indictment for Jacob Rudd. The charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, tampering with federal rail infrastructure, attempted murder, and wartime embezzlement. It wouldn't all stick, but enough would. As the marshals took Crane away, he turned once and smiled faintly. "This doesn't stop it," he said. "You've just stirred the coals." "Good," I replied. "Let them burn." Chapter 7, The Shaft Beneath Shaft 12. Snow lashed against the windows of Pine Hollow as evening fell, the kind that sticks to lamp posts and turns the world into a blurred painting. Inside the station house, Holloway sat with his head in his hands, exhausted, while Crane stared at the wall of his cell with the infuriating calm of a man who still believed his influence reached further than iron bars. Judge Rook's marshals prepared to escort both men to Harrisburg by morning, but there was one thing still gnawing at me. The ledger wasn't complete. Somewhere below the mine, in a section we hadn't yet explored, I was certain Baird had hidden the final proof, records that would tie Rudd to every missing dollar and every order of sabotage. Holloway had mentioned Vault 2, but there had been whispers of a deeper level, a hollow under Shaft 12 that miners swore was abandoned after a cave-in. If Rudd is the man holding the handle, I told Hiram, he'll have a grip strong enough to cut us loose if even a sliver of evidence is missing. We need every page before they can claim we fabricated this. Hiram grimaced, adjusting his lantern strap. "You mean go back down there? After Crane tried to bury us?" "Yes. Tonight. Before the snow seals the entrance." The path to Shaft 12 was nearly invisible under the new snow, and the wind knifed through our coats. We pried the boards loose and descended again into the cold, damp dark. The shaft groaned around us. Water dripped steadily from somewhere deep in the rock. Each step down the ladder rungs creaked with the weight of ice and time. By lantern light, the lower chamber looked just as we had left it, footprints frozen in mud, lantern hooks lining the wall, and the iron vault door closed tight. But now I noticed something different. A seam in the rock. I crouched and pressed my hand to it. A faint draft touched my fingers. "Air," I whispered. "There's a space behind here." Hiram ran his gloved hands along the wall until he found the edge of a small, recessed lever, a mining hatch cleverly disguised as rock. We heaved it open, sending a puff of stale air into our faces. A narrow tunnel sloped downward, slick with frost. "This is it," I said. We descended into the hidden level. The air grew colder and heavier. Our lanterns threw trembling shadows on walls blackened by coal and scorched by some long-forgotten fire. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a chamber braced with thick timber beams. And there it was. A second vault. This one wasn't iron. It was oak reinforced with steel bands, the wood scarred with age. Its padlock had rusted, but Hiram pried it off with a miner's spike. Inside, under a canvas sheet, lay several weathered ledgers, a tin cash box, and a bundle of yellowed telegrams bound with twine. We knelt in the dirt and examined the contents. One ledger bore the title, Civil Account 1864 to 1865. The handwriting was different from Holloway's. It was elegant, flowing, and signed with initials, Jr. I flipped a page. Transfer 12 crates via Blackwell. Reported as 9. Balance 3 for Haven Trust. Another. EC confirms diversion. BH ensures rails clear. Pinkerton inquiries noted, delay shipment to avoid exposure. The last line froze me. Pinkerton inquiries noted. Hiram leaned over my shoulder. They were tracking you. I nodded grimly. They knew someone would come looking. Baird must have realized that once they found out he'd written to me. In the tin cash box, we found U.S. Army payroll certificates dating back to 1864, missing funds from war supply lines. It was the skeleton key to Rudd's entire history of fraud. This is enough to ruin him in federal court, I said. A faint rumble interrupted us. Dust shook from the ceiling. Then a second sound, timber cracking. Hiram swung the lantern toward the tunnel. The entrance, he said. Someone's sealing it. We ran up the slope, boots slipping on the damp rock. Light from above flickered faintly through the hatchway, then disappeared as boards slammed into place. A muffled voice barked orders we couldn't make out. Snow filtered through cracks like drifting ash. They're trying to bury us, Hiram said. I scanned the walls. Look for ventilation shafts. There's always one. We followed the cold draft until we reached a narrow vertical passage choked with ice. A ladder of rusted rungs led up toward faint daylight. I went first, gripping the icy iron. Halfway up, a rung snapped under my boot, and I slammed into the wall, the cold rock knocking the wind from me. Hiram braced me until I found a foothold. We climbed in silence, hearts pounding, until at last my gloved hand broke through snow and into the open air. I pulled myself out, gasping, and reached for Hiram. We tumbled into a clearing behind the coal tipple, covered in snow, just as the last pink light of sunset bled across the horizon. And there, in the distance, a shadow moved toward a waiting sleigh. Even in the dim light, I recognized the figure. Rudd, I muttered. We returned to the station house under cover of dark, carrying the second ledger and the tin box. Holloway flinched when he saw us, like men rising from the grave. You weren't supposed to come back from down there, he whispered. Tell me something I don't know, I said, slamming the ledgers on the table. Rudd's trying to erase the only trail left. Then he knows, Hiram said, that tomorrow will be his last day as a free man. I looked at Holloway, then at Crane in his cell. The shaft beneath shaft 12 nearly became our tomb, I said. But now it's his gallows. Chapter 8, Fire on the Tracks. The next morning, Pine Hollow woke to a pale sky streaked with smoke from the coal fires. But this time, the smoke carried the weight of reckoning. Judge Rook had assembled a small convoy, 2 U.S. Marshals, a snow-dusted carriage, and a handful of local deputies who had never seen federal authority ride into their quiet, grimy town. Our evidence, the ledgers, the cipher, Baird's notes, and the tin cash box, was sealed in a steel case chained to my wrist. Rudd would be boarding the 912 freight from the Riverside Depot, just as he had for years when overseeing his inspections. He didn't know yet that the law had finally caught up to him. Hiram and I watched the platform from behind a stack of coal barrels. There, Hiram whispered. Jacob Rudd emerged from the depot, tall and broad, with his fur collar pulled up and a cigar clamped between his teeth. 2 hired guards flanked him. He carried no bags, only a polished leather folio, the kind that could hold legal papers or a ledger page cut neatly free. I waited until he stepped onto the platform, scanning the train as if he owned it. "Jacob Rudd," I called. His head turned sharply. "I am Allan Pinkerton, operating under federal authority. You are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder." He froze for a moment before smiling faintly. "You've made a mistake, detective." "No," I said, stepping forward, "but you made several." I nodded to Hiram, who produced the cipher pages and held them aloft. "These ledgers tie you to diverted funds, wartime embezzlement, and the death of Lawrence Baird. And we have a witness, your own man Holloway, ready to testify that you ordered him to tamper with the rails." The smile faded. "You think one frightened miner will bury me?" "No," I said. "The truth will." Suddenly, a shot cracked across the platform. One of Rudd's guards had drawn, but Hiram was quicker. He fired once, hitting the man's shoulder and sending him sprawling. The other guard bolted. Rudd spun toward the train, as if considering a desperate leap onto the rear car, but the marshals closed in, revolvers leveled. The passengers had scattered behind crates and snowbanks, eyes wide with the thrill of danger and justice entwined. "End of the line, Rudd," I said. He raised his hand slowly. "You'll never keep it quiet. Men like me don't fall alone. When I talk, half the syndicate falls with me." "Good," I said. "Let it fall." We transported him to the station house, where Crane was waiting in his cell. The two men locked eyes. For the first time since I'd met him, Elias Crane looked unsettled. "You let him catch you," Crane muttered. "You let him chase me," Rudd snarled. "You were supposed to burn the ledger, Elias." "I tried," Crane said softly. "He was faster. I let them stew in their shared failure as Judge Rook read the charges formally." Holloway, pale but resolute, gave his statement. Then signed confession, and the cipher key provided the final nail. By nightfall, the first telegraph reports were already racing across Pennsylvania. Rail magnate arrested in Pine Hollow fraud and murder case. The next day, we escorted the prisoners to Harrisburg under armed guard. Snow blurred the countryside into a smear of white and gray, but my thoughts were sharp. I thought of Lawrence Baird, of the quiet courage it took for a single man with a pencil and a keen eye to challenge a machine built on corruption and fear. I thought of Evelyn Cordell, of Tobias Venn, and of every honest worker whose name had been stolen into a cipher of betrayal. When we arrived at the federal court, I delivered the ledgers personally to the clerk. The evidence filled 3 tables. Rudd said nothing, but Crane leaned back in his chair and whispered, almost admiringly, "You do have a way of stirring the coals, Pinkerton." "Stirring coals uncovers fire," I replied. "And fire leaves nothing hidden." Weeks later, the trial shook the state. Rudd's Haven Trust records matched every entry in our ciphers. Holloway's testimony placed him at the heart of the derailment plot. Crane tried to bargain, but his history of deception undermined him. In the end, Rudd was sentenced to life in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy, with an additional 20 years for his role in Baird's death. Crane received 30. Holloway, for his cooperation, faced 10 years and the weight of his own guilt. As for Pine Hollow, the mine changed hands, and the lantern room was emptied for good. One evening, long after the case was closed, I returned to the shaft alone. Snow covered the tipple like a burial shroud. I placed a single lantern at the entrance and thought of the men whose lives had ended in darkness, one buried in the ledger's ink, another under the weight of his own secrets. Hiram joined me, silent. "Funny thing about coal," I said at last. You dig long enough in the dark, and sooner or later, you bring something burning to the surface. He nodded. And sometimes it lights the whole world.